Trick shots are very fun. They can be used to create excitement or tension. And the best ones can be used to showcase an archer's skill with a bow at the same time as some of their other qualities. Which is why pretty much every story featuring archers for the last few thousand years has featured at least one cool or impressive shot. As an archer myself, I've spent the last few years trying to find ways to replicate and modify those tricks, as well as developing a couple of my own. Today I'm going to take 5 trick shots from film, TV, myth and legend, talk about what makes them awesome, discuss the reality and the history behind them, and then attempt to recreate them, or at least get as close as I can. So, with a small amount of further ado, let's get into it. A popular question on my weapons videos is which would be best in an apocalypse? A bow is a versatile choice. It can be used for hunting and can pick off individuals without alerting larger hordes, while a big sword could cut through swathes of undead, and an axe can double as a useful tool. But what if there aren't any zombies? Let's be honest, whether you get isekai'd to a medieval setting or the world goes to crap in a future one, fighting is going to be secondary to survival, because this means nothing if you can't find food. And unless you can maintain it, even the fanciest gear will eventually become useless. And at times like that, you might just turn to the book. But seriously, if you've ever wondered how you might rebuild civilization if you went back in time or in an apocalypse, this is a pretty good guide on where to start. With information and artwork on everything from building simple shelters to molecular gastronomy, seasoned with fun references, fantasy, and a hidden quest that could win a prize, it's a fun read even if the apocalypse doesn't happen. And if it does, with 400 pages of info and a solid hardback cover, it can double as a weapon, or even as protection. So if you like combining history, science, and fantasy, check out the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. It might just save your life. And now that that's further ado, let's have a look at shooting apples. They say an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but the same definitely cannot be said for archers. Apples are a very popular target for both real and fictional trick shooters for a variety of reasons. They're small, which allows you to demonstrate skill by shooting them. They can be found in both modern and historical settings, which makes them a really relatable and easily translatable thing. Everybody kind of roughly knows what size they are, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on using them as props. But the way in which they're used can vary massively. One of the more frequent is an homage to the classic William Tell shot. In the original legend, William Tell, a Swiss crossbowman, was forced to shoot an apple off of his son's head, or they would both be executed for failing to pay respect to a lord. It demonstrates not only the skill of the crossbowman in question, but also his ability to hold his nerve under pressure. Failure in this instance means not just missing, but also the death of his child, possibly at his own hands, and then his own execution. Which is why in the original story he actually takes 2 crossbow bolts, one of which will be for the nobleman if the first one misses. Now personally, I really like this original version. It establishes very, very high stakes and allows you to build a lot of tension in the build-up to that shot, even if it is a little bit overdone by today. I've actually attempted to replicate it myself using a lot of safety measures, and even knowing that the person underneath the apple is wearing protection on their head that will not let an arrow get through it, it is still absolutely terrifying when you're used to target shooting to be shooting with somebody in front of you. So imagine doing that with live bolts, no protection at all, and your child's life at stake. It really, really adds an extra element of fear to what is otherwise, functionally, a much more straightforward shot than a lot of the others that I'm going to cover today. Because while an apple is pretty small, shooting one with a bow or a crossbow is not much different from regular target shooting, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Often when you're trying to show a high level of skill in a human character, adding the human element of emotion rather than necessarily taking the skill to levels that are unbelievable can make a much more compelling story. But what about when you don't have that element? Several more recent apple shooting tricks use the apple in a different way. In Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen shoots an apple from the mouth of a roast pig that is being served at a banquet for the people who are essentially judging the value of her life. This allows the apple to represent the conspicuous consumption of the capital, while also demonstrating both Katniss's skill under pressure and her lack of regard for her captors. But the version I want to talk about today comes from the Wednesday TV series on Netflix and is notable for being literally the only time we see that character shoot a bow. She turns up at an archery range with an apple, throws it in the air, shoots it, and impales it to the center of the target. It's heavily featured on the trailers for the show, and it's a really, really cool shot with a few issues. One thing the Wednesday and the Hunger Games shots share is that their apples don't behave like a real apple. In both instances, the arrow hits it, impales it, and then carries it to a different surface where it then sticks in. But apples in real life don't work that way. For starters, when you hit one with an arrow at high speed, it tends to split. And even if you can impale it, the arrow tends to go straight through them rather than carrying them and impaling them to a target. Which means that for this shot to work, you need to not only be able to hit a moving apple that is in the air at the time, you also need to get lucky enough to hit it in such a way that the arrow impales rather than splitting the apple, and throw it so that it's close enough to the target that said impalement actually sticks it in rather than passing straight through. Which is quite a big ask. So let's see how long it takes. Why did I start with this one? This is like the hardest shot I'm going to do. Oh. So there's the problem about it not wanting to impale. Nah. Okay, I've actually destroyed a lot more apples than I thought. I came here with 18 and I'm down to 3, so I'm going to get right in close and hopefully it will allow me to pin one without it shattering, because so far every single one I've hit has split, some of them more than once. We're making a sort of cute love heart shape at least. Okay, I'm down to my last apple. I've gone through 17. I don't know how many direct or indirect hits that's been, because some of them I've used more than once, if there wasn't too much taken off them. Let's see if I can do this. Nice and central though. You can definitely hit an apple and then hit the center of the target. Okay, I think that's it. So to sum up overall, because I've run out of apples and I've got other stuff to do, this is a very tricky shot. There's a lot that goes into it in terms of skill, and it showcases Wednesday's skill very, very well in the series, because it shows that she's accurate, she's confident, she knows that she can reliably do this, and she can throw accurately as well as shooting quickly and with good timing. There's also, in real life, a significant chunk of luck involved. Now, the Addams family members don't always follow the laws of physics, in fact, frequently don't, so I don't think that's a huge issue in this case. Either way, it's a cool shot. The only thing I don't like about it is that it is actually harder in real life than it looks. In the show, it looks like you have to be good enough to hit an apple when it's over the center of the target, but in real life, that isn't enough on its own. There's also an element of, call it luck, call it skill, that goes beyond that for hitting the apple in such a way as to not split it. So it actually doesn't showcase to a regular eye all the difficulty involved in the task. But otherwise, it's cool, and it's time to move on. Next up is the oldest trick in the book, or at least the oldest one in this video, and it's kind of a twofer. In the ancient Greek epic poem, the Odyssey, and therefore its adaptations like Epic and The Return, and presumably the upcoming Chris Nolan film, Odysseus returns home after 20 years at war and finds that his house has been overrun with people who want to shag his wife. And so in order to fend them off, she has set a challenge involving Odysseus's old bow and a bunch of axes. Essentially, anyone that can string the bow and then shoot through 12 axes will be the person that she marries. Ultimately, all of them struggle with both tasks, apart from Odysseus himself, who, even though he's been away for 20 years, is able to easily string his bow without effort, and then shoot through 12 axes. So I guess the questions are, what's so hard about stringing a bow, and what does shooting through 12 axes actually mean? Stringing a bow is essentially the process of putting tension into it. So when I store this bow, which is a 60-pound recurve, I store it like this. The string is looped around here so I don't lose it or lose its position, but it's otherwise not tensioned up. And this means that the limbs aren't under any stress. It's not as likely to warp if there's any changes in temperature or anything like that. It's less likely to be damaged, and it's less likely to gain a permanent bend, which will essentially weaken it over time. So when I do want to use it, I have to string it up. And because I'm a lazy bugger, I do this without a stringer, like this. Now the bow is tensioned, it's good to go, bam. And the heavier the draw weight, the more effort it takes to string. But that's not all, because Odysseus's bow was described as palintonos, or bent backward. Palintonos is a way of producing bows that allows them to have even more tension when they're strung and allow them to shoot arrows even faster. And what it essentially means is that the limbs, when it's strung, bend the opposite way to when it's unstrung. When you want to string the bow like this, simply pulling it back to gain tension has a tendency to cause it to flip. And even modern stringers that are designed to string recurve bows don't work very well for this kind of thing. Instead, you need to either have some specialized equipment for tying the limbs to get them to bend back, or you need to have a very, very good grasp of the way that that particular bow works and be able to maneuver your body into a position that allows you to put that tension on without it catapulting back in your face. I can shoot this bow, it's 110 pounds. It is probably less than a lot of war bows could have been, and it takes all of my body to string it. And that's part of what Odysseus was about. He was a very, very strong hero, but he was also very clever. And the fact that he had the guile and skill to be able to string this bow was a part of his character, just as much as having the strength. The next part of the challenge was to shoot through 12 axes. And there is a lot of debate about what this means. The simplest and most face value interpretation of those words is that there were 12 axes, and he took an arrow and he shot it through all 12 of them, piercing the metal and coming out the other side. That's probably not it. Now, admittedly, ancient Greek axes were made of bronze rather than steel, which is a little bit softer. But unadmittedly, so were the arrowheads. And regardless of how strong your bow is, piercing through a lump of metal with a sharpened bit of the same type of metal is generally not gonna work. So shooting through 12 axes in that way goes beyond the idea of superhuman strength and into imaginary physics. All of which is essentially irrelevant destructive testing, because in the text of the story it explicitly states that he shot through what is sometimes translated as the eye of the axis. So what does that mean? One interpretation that I've seen a few times in films is the idea that there was some kind of loop or circle on the back of the axis. And I don't like that for two reasons. One is that there's no real evidence that axes had loops on the back of them at the time. And two is that even with a relatively large loop like this, if I place it over here and then shoot an arrow at it, it's very hard to say without the use of a slow motion camera whether that actually passed through the ring or whether it knocked the outside of it. So if you have 12 of those in a row and an arrow skims along the side of them, to a passing audience or an audience stood at a distance, there really is no way of telling whether that succeeded. Which makes it a little bit patchy when you're considering a test in the ancient world without any slow-mo cameras or anything like that. You could just about, probably if you had really good eyesight or if you placed a tiny target at the far end of the holes, tell whether it had succeeded, but it wouldn't be a very good visual example. The other thing to bear in mind is the shape of axes. At the time in ancient Greece, axes made of bronze frequently had holes in their shape, whether it's an epsilon axe like this or one a little bit more like that. And they were designed that way partly because of limits of metallurgy at the time. It allowed the head to be lighter weight, less likely to have flaws in it, various other things. But a lot of axes at the time looked like that. So when you write about shooting through the socket of an axe head or the hole of an axe head or the eye of an axe head, to an audience of the time, an axe like that is a reasonably likely candidate for something that would come up. Now, when I did a video about this last time, a lot of people also pointed out, or very angrily in some cases, pointed out that this was talking about the socket of the axe itself, the bit that encloses around here. Now, this example of an Epsilon axe was made by a local blacksmith, Ruby Ferguson, to be essentially a prop for this shot. But as you can see, it didn't have a complete socket that went all the way around, and a lot of axes at the time didn't. So what is easily interpreted today as meaning a socket may not have meant a socket back then. Now, that isn't to say that it wasn't a socket. There were socketed axes, and axes were frequently stored without a haft on them, and so stringing them up and shooting through the sockets is reasonably plausible. I don't know. This stuff was written a really long time ago, and even that was hundreds of years after the story was first told, which was also sometime after it supposedly happened. There may not be a single correct answer here. I'm more than willing to admit that the socket interpretation could be as valid or potentially more valid than the hold axe version, but I like the hold axe version because A, it establishes something really cool about historical axes, and B, it establishes a window of failure. If I'm trying to shoot through, as you can see from a previous test, 12 of these things and I miss, that is really obvious. But how hard actually is it to shoot through 12 holes? This is the point in the video where my budget hits its limits. I have one axe and I have 11 circles of card. On the surface of it, shooting through 12 holes shouldn't really be any different from shooting at one hole. If you can hit the one at the back, which is your furthest and therefore smallest target, you can hit all the ones on the way and you're gravy. Except arrows don't work that way. Because while modern bows tend to be designed to have a little shelf cut out in them so the arrow can fly straight, ancient bows had nothing of the sort. Much like this one, the arrow is sat slightly to the side of center. So when you shoot, it doesn't in fact fly in a straight line, it instead curves around the handle of the bow and wobbles its way into place. Which means if I want to shoot through a narrow gap, I need to get the release on that arrow absolutely smooth as I can so that it's not wobbling its way through and hitting everything on the way. Even just one deflection or hit on the back of the arrow will cause the front of it to crash into what, in this case, would be a metal axe and send it crashing to a halt, or snapping it. I'll admit the cardboard gives me a little bit more leeway, but even then, it's going to deflect, it's not going to make its way through my hardest point, which is the hole at the far end. Okay, here's our axe, here's our holes. Now, the thing that I need to bear in mind about this is that I actually have to be quite close for this lineup to work, and that means that I'm going to get some of that skipping and bending off of the bow, which means I need to aim essentially as though I'm stood about 6 inches to the left of where I'm actually stood, so that we get a nice smooth flight through the holes and we don't crash into them. Let's see how it goes. And there we have it. The arrow has passed through the axe at the end. The rings at either end are intact. This is eminently doable, and by somebody of Odysseus' skill, a warrior, an archer, and somebody who fought in battle with a bow, this is very much a plausible shot, by all means. Whether you're talking about sockets or whether you're talking about axe heads, this is something that could have happened, and that gives it an extra air of, like, cool to it. This is a legend. This is about a guy who conceivably existed, and I really enjoy that this shot, even if I'm fudging it a little bit here with the cardboard and everything, is doable by somebody with enough skill. Like, that's awesome. So far, both shots shown use relatively standard target shooting, with the trick coming from the thing being shot. But this next one is the other way around. Archery multi-shots crop up in all sorts of visual media, from films to TV to video games to comic books. And it's hard to deny that they look incredibly cool. Like the apple shot, these can be handled in a few different ways, whether it's close range damage, shotgun style scatter, or even for accurate shooting against multiple targets. But as with several of these shots, there are issues with physics. The first problem is that bows work using muscle power to draw them back, but the maximum amount of power you can put into a bow is fixed by the limbs of the bow itself. Which means that if I shoot a single arrow, that arrow has the same amount of energy that has to be spread now across all three. Meaning that on impact, one arrow can have much higher penetration than three. So if your target's wearing armor or has a thick hide, that multi-shot might not actually do enough to kill it. There's also a matter of speed. Even with speed knocks involved, knocking and shooting single arrows is a lot more straightforward than trying to knock two at once, in which you might have to rotate both of them independently to get them on the string. So if I'm trying to be quick, it might be better to shoot one arrow at a time than three at once. Especially if I'm prepared to do some speed shooting. But that's not to say it couldn't have a use. With a heavier draw bow, my maximum rate of shooting is greatly reduced. And if the things I'm fighting don't need all of that power, then two lighter arrows might allow a more efficient approach, while still giving enough penetration to do the job. And if those arrows are tipped with bladed broadheads, then shooting three of them into a big monster will cause a lot of internal damage. It certainly wouldn't be my go-to approach, but if I had the drop on something, or I don't know, standing on its back, then it might just have a valid use. But what about multiple targets? Assuming your bow has enough power to launch multiple arrows effectively, wouldn't this be a good way to deal with more than one enemy? Yes and no, because this is a trick shot. The only way with an unmodified bow that I can shoot two arrows at two different points is to space them using the riser in the middle. I can knock one arrow above the other and have them ready to shoot, but the gap is fixed by the width of my bow, which gives me a fixed spread. So while I can hit both of those targets from here, if I was to stand here, I can only hit one. And if I'm here, I've got the opposite problem. So assuming that my enemies are at exactly the right distance apart, and I've got time to knock two arrows, it could be a useful approach, but I've got very limited capacity to track two moving targets in the way that you tend to see in films. But what about three arrows? In the extremely historically accurate Bollywood film Bahubali 2, which I've definitely pronounced wrong, the title character shows a princess how to shoot three arrows at once in a way that is both fast and accurate, allowing both of them to immediately defeat an entire battalion of enemies. And it's notable for being the only time I've ever seen anyone attempt to explain the technique involved in their character shooting multiple arrows. Essentially, he uses a reverse draw technique, holding your fingers like this, and he puts the arrows between his fingers when drawing them from the quiver, knocks them down onto the bow. I've somehow managed to grab four, and shoots them right away. But as you can see, it's a little bit harder than that, because I've just had to make sure all those knocks are lined up before I can shoot them. Okay, so maybe I've got a bit to learn on the speed, but can I hit three targets with that approach? Unlike my two arrow technique, this one doesn't actually have anything spacing the arrows apart, so there isn't any real way to make sure they all fly separately. Which is fine if you have divine powers, but for a mere mortal like me, I'm going to need to adapt. I can try spacing the arrows on this end using my fingers, which gives me some form of spread. So after that, maybe it's about the aim. Still only getting the one in the middle. Sort of. Let's see if we can get that a little bit cleaner. Yes! So yes, you can technically shoot three arrows at three different targets using an unmodified bow. Unfortunately, holding the bow sideways like this to allow me to get a horizontal spread has robbed the bow of even more of its energy than if I'd been able to pull it all the way back. Which means that these have really barely stuck into the target at all. If they were really sharp and you had poisoned arrowheads, maybe this would work as an approach. But I personally think the two arrow one is your best bet. That said, if you're not looking to track individual targets and you're just trying to get as many arrows into a mass as possible, like if you're shooting a volley down from a castle, and again you've got a nice heavy draw bow, then I don't see a particular reason why it would be a terrible idea, aside from the fact that you're going to deplete your arrows 3 times as quickly as you otherwise might. Ultimately, this is a really cool trick, and when it's used for a burst of close-range damage, or as a one-off against multiple enemies, then I will absolutely root for this shot. The only time I don't like it is when it's used as a lazy alternative to showing one of the many cool speed shooting techniques that have been used throughout history. Leaving behind the realm of fantasy once again, we're going to go back into historical trick shots with splitting the arrow. Most commonly associated with Robin Hood, this has since been used by several other fictional archers as a way of showing how skilled they are, that they can shoot an arrow into the back of another one with enough precision to split it all the way down its length. But is it actually possible? In archery, a Robin Hood is when you shoot an arrow into the back of one you've already shot. With modern carbon arrows, you get something known as telescoping, where one arrow sticks into the back of the other one and gets maybe this far down. With wooden ones, you get a similar effect, but it sends a chip of wood shearing off to the side. For one to split all the way down the middle is so unlikely that it gets out of the realm of skill and into the realm of sheer blind luck. And yes, I know, your uncle's friend Steve has done this once on an archery range by accident. It's very, very possible. But I've never met any Steves. I don't know anyone that has seen this happen from end to end firsthand, ever. And in the entire history of every filmed archery shot that we have ever seen, there are no examples where the grain has been split all the way. So why is that? Like with a lot of these things, it's a problem of physics. As discussed earlier, arrows bend in flight. It's a necessary part of the design in order to be able to shoot them accurately. But what that means is that one of these is designed that if you put a bunch of force into this end of it, it goes like this. So if you're trying to split it end to end with another arrow, the minute your arrow collides with the back of it, you've lost the straightness of the grain and you're not going to get a clean shear through it. Not only that, but wooden arrows throughout history have been designed to resist impact from that end. If they were easily split by hitting them in the center, then the bowstring is quite likely to split the timber fibers apart and get stuck. So, ancient arrows used horn, or threading, or other techniques in order to make them strong enough to be shot. Which again means that when you hit it with an arrow, it is much more likely to bend, warp, or flick to the side than to split. Does that mean that these shots are bad? No. Having the arrow split all the way down the length and then the new one enter the same spot on the target is a much more visually exciting demonstration of the accuracy and skill involved in hitting the back of an arrow than just having a chip fly off to the side of it. So for films, TV, media, etc., that is a really cool way of showing the skill of the archer. And in fact, this one, in Brave, is arguably one of my favourite archery shots ever. Not because of that bit, but because beforehand it goes into a lot of slow-mo detail and loving care about the way that an arrow moves in flight, which is exactly what I've been talking about when I say that they bend. But does that mean that the Robin Hood myth is a lie? Not necessarily. For starters, when we look at arrows from the period at which the stories are set, they didn't actually use horn inserts in the nock just yet. They instead used wider nocks, like this, which gave it the kind of strength that it needs, but it also makes it a lot more plausible that someone could hit an arrow into the back of another one. So if we allow for Robin Hood hitting another arrow, but not necessarily cleaving it all the way down its length, then you've got something that's a lot more viable. Because with a nock with a width more like this, and a bladed arrowhead, you might be able to get a more convincing split. Or maybe not. But either way, I'm not here to retread ground that Mythbusters covered. Because like Odysseus, Robin Hood began not as a character in a written novel, but as someone who was part of an oral spoken tradition. And by the time the first novels were written down that we've found, it had been quite a long time since the character supposedly existed. And we don't know whether the splitting the arrow that appears in some of those early stories actually happened as an arrow splitting right to the end, or whether it's an exaggeration of something else. For instance, shooting at rods or staves that have been hammered into the ground was a known training technique. So if you wanted to take that a step further while keeping it plausible, shooting at an arrow gives you a version of this trick with no reality warping required. Is that the intent of the original myth? Probably not. It's quite likely that storytellers at the time were exaggerating tales of people hitting the back of a nock and then extending it to go all the way through to represent the ultimate form of accuracy. But if we're looking for a more grounded example, or an example that I can do today, this is as close as I'm going to get. But if that's not exciting enough for you, you could always try shooting the arrow while it's still in the air. So now, as we head towards late afternoon, we come into the final trick shot of the day, and that is shooting arrows out of the air. I've seen this one a couple of times, most notably in Disney's Robin Hood, in which Robin's shot is knocked off deliberately by the Sheriff of Nottingham, and he corrects the course of the arrow by shooting it while it's in the air. I've also seen it in the Hawkeye TV series, which I largely liked, but I did not like this version of the shot because he uses a combination of this and the Robin Hood arrow split to achieve something that he's been shown to be able to achieve pretty well with just 3 arrows in the past. So it seems a bit overkill and requires a little too much suspension of disbelief. There is another version of it in an earlier episode, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's focus on the Robin Hood one. I have previously gone on record saying this shot is impossible. And the reason I said that is because if you shoot an arrow out of your bow, and then you shoot a second arrow out of your bow, it will never have time to catch up because they travel at the same speed. So it doesn't actually matter how fast you are at drawing them because the second one's never going to catch the first. There are caveats to that, and a lot of people pointed these out in the comments, so I'm going to discuss those a little bit now. If you do not pull the bow all the way back, your arrow will travel slower, which means that a second arrow that is drawn all the way would potentially have a chance to overtake it. But as you can see here, an arrow that travels slower has a much shorter range. So, and this happens in the story, it would have to go up into the air. But because it has a lower range and less energy, it arcs very rapidly. A similar version was also discussed by using different weighted arrows. Essentially, if I use a really heavy arrow with a lower weight bow, then it also travels slower than a lighter arrow shot from the same bow. And in theory, you have a chance to catch it up. In this story, Robin Hood is not setting this up as a trick shot. This is not a deliberate and intent thing, so he's using the same arrows in both shots. Also, even if you are intending to set this up as a trick shot, you're going to run into the same problem, which is that an arrow that is traveling slower has a more pronounced arc in the way that it flies. If it's traveling slow enough for a second arrow to catch it, it will have arced fairly significantly, and you're going to be hitting it on the way down. Which brings me to my solution. Hit the arrow on the way down. Because if we do allow the arrows to arc in flight, then 2 shots from the same bow can overtake each other. So if your scenario has the first arrow knocked so far off course that it's coming back down in front of the target, your second arrow might just be able to intercept it before it hits the ground. So let's try and catch that on camera. And there you have it. Even if you're little old me, you can deflect an arrow out of the air. Could you deflect it into another target? Again, way, way, way beyond my skill level. It's kind of like the Wednesday Addams thing, right? Like, this is a cartoon Robin Hood doing a cartoon trick. I'm willing to give it a bit of slack. But yes, you can shoot an arrow out of the air. Incidentally, this actually makes it a lot closer to the other shooting arrow out of the air trick that I've seen in the Hawkeye series, in which Clint shoots one arrow, which is coming down to hit a van, and then Kate hits that arrow with an embiggening arrow, if you will, to turn it into a giant missile that impales the back of said van. I really like that. I think that shot shows incredible teamwork, and both people have a very challenging shot to make. To arc an arrow down onto a moving target, phenomenal. To hit an arrow that's arcing down onto a moving target, also phenomenal. So, yeah, I like this shot. I think it's very, very cool. I think it's a very fun training technique to shoot a bunch of arrows in the air and then try and hit them on the way down. I couldn't do it on command, but that doesn't mean that someone who is sufficiently skilled and sufficiently fantastical couldn't. And I don't think it's hugely implausible to have that done as a one-off Hail Mary, even if the arrow's heading towards you, to knock it out of the air. I think it's viable. And that's it. I've done all these shots to the best of my ability. I need to go charge my electrical equipment, take a break, grab a drink, something to eat, and then get this video edited and ready to post. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed making it, and let me know if there are other tricks that you think are cool or that you'd like to see more of down below. I'd particularly like to try and look next time at some of the ones that are based around a bit more agility, maybe shooting from treetops, or like the Legolas going downstairs one, which has been on a dream list of mine for forever. I'd also like to find out a little bit more about the kind of fantasy shots that you see in Eastern mythology, because basically everything I've got here is from Europe, and it would be nice to branch out a little bit as well. As always, if you want to support these videos, check out the sponsor for today, or pop on over to Patreon, where you can get more behind the scenes content and bonus materials and tutorials. And if you like tutorials for archery, you can head on over to my College of Arrows, where I've got a bunch of breakdowns on how to shoot a bow, how to do some various different instinctive styles, and we just chat about archery. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next one.